Greetings and welcome back to Haftarot, the weekly video cast in which we take a look at the upcoming week's Haftara, understand its basic message, and see how it is related to the Kriyat HaTorah that it follows. Now, just one note about last week's Haftara is that we were not able to make a connection between the Haftara and the Kriyat HaTorah. And the reality is we were not able to do that the last 2 weeks either beforehand, because the three special haftarot that are read between Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av have their own themes, which seem to be disconnected from Kriyat HaTorah. However, in next week's session, we'll see something that may alleviate that disconnect, at least to some extent. My name is Yitzchak Etshalom, and I'm delighted to be looking with you at the Haftara of Shabbat Vaethanan, which is always the Shabbat immediately after Tisha B'Av, and therefore is the Shabbat in which we begin to read about God's consoling the Jewish people after the Churban through Yeshayahu Hanavi. In the past, we've spoken about the sections of Yeshayahu that begin in chapter 40 in Perek Mem, even though there's several selections in Perek Lamed Hey and earlier parts that seem to belong to a later prophet who operated in Bavel during the exile, and an even later prophet who operated in Yerushalayim during the rebuilding. And these were all collected into the book known as Yeshayahu. And all of the Haftarot that we're going to read over the course of these next 7 weeks are taken from that second part of Yeshayahu, the Yeshayahu of Nechama, of consolation. I just want to point out that this custom of these particular 7 haftarot, which are called Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 of consolation, is an old tradition. It's one of the oldest set or fixed set of haftarot. As I mentioned numerous times, haftarot are very much up to the individual community and sometimes the individual reader to choose what piece from the Nevi'im to read. But these haftarot became fixed quite early. They're mentioned in the Psikta of Rav Kahana, which is, as I point out here, a 6th or 7th century work from Eretz Yisrael. They're already identified as the Haftarot, and that's why this does not vary community to community. All communities read these 7 Haftarot, and pretty much the same exact verses. And so that's as we begin the process of Nechama. But let's take a look at our Haftara. And it opens with the beginning of Nechama, which is when the prophet speaks to the people and says, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, Yomar Elohechem. Your God says, be comforted, be comforted. And the mode of speaking to the people is, these are people who have gone through tragedy. They have been exiled. They're in Bavel currently. The Mikdash is destroyed. Their kingdom was destroyed. Sovereignty is lost. And they are suffering. The truth is they're not even suffering that badly in Bavel, but they're suffering because they're in Bavel. And they're suffering because they are outside of their land. And God says, I'm going to comfort you. I'm going to bring you back. Yerushalayim has already suffered enough, and I'm going to bring you back to Yerushalayim. And there's a few lines that I want to highlight here to give you a sense of this Haftara. In Pasuk Gimel, Kol Korei Bamidbar, there's a voice crying out in the Midbar, Panu Derech Adonai, make room for the path to God. Yashrum Ba'arava Mesilah Eloheinu, straighten out in the plain or in the desert a road for our God, as if to say that God is coming and the people are coming back, and it continues there. And then that this culminates with a beautiful call in the pasuk that I've highlighted here. Al har gavoa alilach mevaseret Zion. You who are giving glad tidings to Zion, go up onto a high mountain. Harimi vakoach kolech mevaseret Yerushalayim. Raise your voice with power. The one who gives good news to Yerushalayim. Harimi al tirai, raise your voice and do not be afraid. Imri le'arei Yehuda, go tell the cities of Yehuda. The cities of Yehuda that right now are destroyed and are fallow and nobody is there. Go announce to them, Hinei Elohechem, God, your God is here. God is returning and God is bringing his children back. It is a beautiful, beautiful sentiment. And just want to point out how this piece ends, because the Yeshayahu throughout this section from chapter 40 on combines the issue of God's consoling his people with God's power as creator. God is the master of all, and yet he's concerned with his little people, a small group of exiles, and of bringing them back and reestablishing them in their land. And as you see in the last pasuk, lift up your eyes and see who created all of this. Hamotziv mispar tzvam. He brings all of the hosts out by number, all of the stars out every night. L'chulam b'shem yikra. He has a name for each one of them. God has created billions and trillions of heavenly bodies, and each one of them is a special creation. Nobody's left out, which means that every creature of God counts. And don't think of yourself as minuscule and as unimportant, which is an important sentiment to share with somebody who is mourning, to somebody who is lost, to somebody who God has turned his back on. Feel I'm not worthy, I can't rebuild, I shouldn't go back, which was the sentiment among many of the people in Bavel. And the best proof is that when they were given the ability to go back, very few of them went back, and they didn't want to rebuild the Mikdash, and they felt very down on themselves. And it took words of consolation and of support and encouragement for them to rebuild. And these are the words that every year we intone as we rise out of the ashes of Tisha B'Av, like the phoenix, to once again slowly restore our sense of self-esteem, restore our sense of bechira, of being chosen, and our connectedness to God, and ultimately be able to stand before God on Rosh Hashanah and to crown him. And the 7 Haftarot, read after Tisha B'Av, take us all the way up until Rosh Hashanah. And so we will follow the path of this Nechama over the course of the next 6 weeks after this. In the meantime, we should have a Shabbat Shalom.